All right, everybody. So Durham has decided to replace the VI SPDAT with a new prioritization scheme. And there are a number of reasons for this. This is something that is sort of happening now around the country. So we're not the only CoC to be doing this, but there are some major reasons that we're moving away from the VI SPDAT. Oh, we've got another person joining. Just hold on. I put a link in the chat for you to sign in. Welcome. Okay, so the VI SPDAT, as many of you are very aware, has very poor inter-rater reliability. What that means is that you might have one provider complete the assessment with the client and get a very different score than the next provider. I'm sorry, y'all, I have to sneeze. And so it often appears that the assessment score is more of a assessment of that client's relationship with that provider than actually of that client's vulnerability themselves. We've got someone else joining. Welcome, Christy. I put in the link in the chat for you to sign in. We notice a particular issue with accurately measuring highly vulnerable clients because the VI SPDAT relies exclusively on self-report, and we often see issues with self-report with the most vulnerable clients. And when you're trying to measure vulnerability and you have an assessment that also is not very good at measuring vulnerability, that's a problem. The VI SPDAT has been shown by a number of CoCs to be racially biased, particularly against Black and African American clients. Hold on, we've got someone else joining. Welcome, Lindy. There's a link in the chat for you to sign in. And we did this assessment in Durham and found very similar data to what has been seen in other jurisdictions. And then finally, the VI SPDAT actually doesn't predict housing outcomes. There's no relationship between a score on the VI SPDAT and how likely a client is to be successful in housing. So for all these reasons, Durham decided that it wanted to develop a new process that no longer uses the VI SPDAT in housing prioritization. So the new prioritization process will be based on a combination of a client's vulnerability and their likelihood to self-resolve. Vulnerability is defined as potential or experienced harm to the household due to continued homelessness. And the likelihood to self-resolve is based on an inventory of housing barriers. So how do we develop these assessments? We conducted a survey of the community. Many of you probably participated in that survey to solicit feedback about community priorities between different types of harm. So we recognize that there are a lot of different types of harm that people experience due to homelessness, and they're all worth caring about, but we couldn't prioritize all of them. So this really helped us to see what the community's values were in this. We also then conducted a review of the literature, of the academic research literature, to understand what factors actually predicted these types of harms in people experiencing homelessness. And then finally, we conducted a survey of the community to select and weight various relevant housing barriers experienced by people in Durham. So these are the various types of harm due to homelessness that we asked the community to rank. And the community ranked them. You can see the place that they got ranked, and we are prioritizing the top 5. So that is client dies as a result of homelessness, which was the community's top priority. The client dies from terminal illness during homelessness. Client experiences complications while giving birth as a result of homelessness. The client is hospitalized as a result of homelessness. And then this last one should be in red. Minor in foster care becomes homeless as an adult. So a client's housing priority score, which is a combination of their vulnerability and their housing barriers, will be used to decide the order in which clients will receive housing slots. Ties will be broken based on lifetime length of time homeless, just like it is now. And there will be a PSH needs assessment that will be used to decide which clients need to be stepped up to PSH from rapid rehousing or housing choice vouchers. So this is the vulnerability assessment. So on the left here, you can see the various items that we're going to be scoring. You can see the number of points that they'll receive. some notes about how they'll be scored, and then the vulnerability item that corresponds to. So basically, clients who have 6 months or more of unsheltered homelessness in the last 2 years will receive 5 points. Those who have a chronic health condition disability will receive 5 points, and those who have a substance abuse disability will receive 5 points. The points correspond to the priority level of the particular vulnerability in the community's community's ranking. So then clients who are terminally ill or hospice eligible will receive 4 points. Each time a client is hospitalized with an overnight stay during their services, a client will receive 1 point up to 3 times, because this is the third item. Hospitalization also includes overnight stays at a psychiatric facility or detox center, but we're not counting nights here, we're counting a stay. So a client needs to be discharged in between the stay to be counted as a separate stay. Clients who are pregnant will receive 3 points. And then clients who are age 25 and younger and NC links eligible will receive 1 point. That's something that relates to a client's eligibility for foster care based on their foster care services when they were younger. This is something that Life Skills and CPS are going to provide the information for us. So the by name list referral process. So all homeless clients who meet one or more of the following criteria will be added to the by names list within 1 week of program entry. And I should say there's no change to this list. Clients who are unsheltered, residing in a Durham CoC emergency shelter, actively fleeing intimate partner violence, or who have exited shelter 4 more times in the past year need to be added to the by names list. The provider must determine and record on the referral, in addition to the other information that you provide, a client's chronicity, the months that they've been unsheltered in the past 3 years. So that's a new item because that's being scored on the vulnerability assessment now. The number and type of disability. So we've added type to the disability so that we can score them on our vulnerability assessment. Whether a client is pregnant, and if they are pregnant, their due date. Again, that's a new item. And then the assigned case manager. So I want to show y'all where these new items lie on the by name list referral. So just give me a second.
Thank you. Crystal, I love your hair.
All right, so this is the referral form. Many of you will be familiar with it, but there are some new items on it. So below the number of disabilities, we are now asking you to report a client's disability types, and you can select all that apply. When you're reporting on a client's disability types, we are asking you to primarily rely on a client's report in HMIS. However, there is also room for your discretion here. So if a client is showing significant signs of a disability that they aren't reporting, we do allow for that discretion. However, we just ask that you make a note on the by name list of that so that we're aware that you've used your discretion to add a disability, and that's something we can discuss. Then here below the number of months the client's been homeless in their lifetime, you'll see this question: how many months the client has been unsheltered in the past 3 years? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more. It only goes up to 6 or more because at 6 or more, the client receives the full points. And then you'll see here, is someone in the household currently pregnant? Yes or no. If you click yes, we will ask you for the due date. This is an approximate due date. The main reason for this is just so I can track people who are way past their due date and who should no longer be receiving the points for being pregnant. It's anyone in the household. So if there's a minor in the household who's pregnant or the partner, that's fine. it's just anyone in the household who's pregnant. Any questions about these new referral items or how to report them before we move on?
I had a question, Hanalea. So, for the by name list now, how would that be operated with the new referral form?
That's a great question. Let me show you, Shanika. Give me a second. Let me switch over to that screen. All right, so this is a training version of the by name list that I created with fake clients just for the purposes of this training. So I can actually show you where these new items lie in the by name list. So right here, you'll see the months unsheltered in the past 3 years is right here. And so you can update it as need be, 6 or more. So let's say your client initially entered and they were at 4, but now they're at 6 or more and you want them to get the points, you can go in and update that. The client's disability type is right here next to number of disabilities. This number of disabilities I haven't decided yet whether this will go away or not in the new system. It's not technically required, but it's still useful information. So I have to decide what to do with that. But the disability type will be right here. And again, you can update that. Let's say initially you went off the client self-report, but then now the client has a new diagnosis of a mental health disability. You could go in and you could select that. And I can show you how that'll affect the points. So let's say you're working with Jennifer Juniper. And initially when she came in, she told you she had a mental health condition, but now she's actually let you know that she actually does have a substance abuse disability as well. And that's not something she felt comfortable reporting. Okay, so you keep an eye on her prioritization score here. You'll see it's currently 9.8, but when I go in and I actually update, okay, Jennifer has a substance abuse disability, you can see her prioritization score is going to immediately jump. So all of this is automated in the by name list based on your responses. And if you pull out of here, it's hidden on the by name list right now, but you can actually see her vulnerability score. I'm trying to unhide the other thing here. So the reason that her priority level jumps so much is because, so if you see her vulnerability score was an 8, but when I added her substance abuse disability, her vulnerability score jumped to a 13, and then that's reflected in her prioritization score. So the other items that are new here, the client's pregnancy is back here. So let's say a client becomes pregnant while they're working with you or someone in their household does, you can go in and update that. And that'll be reflected in a score. Again, if you're going to update pregnancy, please just put an approximate due date. And then some items that I'm not asking you to report on the initial referral, but you can go in and update as appropriate is, let's say you're working with a client and then they go to the hospital and they stay for 2 nights. You can actually go in and add a new hospital stay into this, and that'll be updated into their score. Same thing if you learn that a client's terminally ill. We're asking that if at all possible, you rely on a client's like medical provider documentation to diagnose terminal illness. If you really can't get that, then that's something to note for discussion on the by name list meeting, because we'll consider it on a case-by-case basis. But we're really hoping to rely on medical provider communications here rather than our own discretion on terminal illness. But all of that will automatically update a client's score. I'm trying to see if there's anything else I missed here. No, I think that's it. So does that answer your question, Shaniqua?
No, it does. So we should be starting to do this starting today, start going in there and changing our clients' information.
Yeah, that's right. I have a slide at the end, but just as a preview, this change is going to take effect October 1. And so you have from now until October 1 to get your clients' information up to date so that they'll be prioritized correctly in the new system.
Hanali, I have a question. I noticed that when you changed Jennifer Juniper and added the substance abuse, the number of disabilities did not change automatically. Is that something we need to be aware of and be conscious to change it when we add?
Yeah, so they're manual right now, and that's a very good point. I don't know if there's a way for me to automate it. And again, I might actually delete the number of disabilities because it's not technically being scored in the new system. I haven't decided what to do with it, but yes, for now it is manual.
And it is helpful because then, since only one of the disabilities is visible, if it says a 3, it will cause you to look further if you're not sure.
Yeah.
So I
That's a
just,
very good, that's a very good point. Yeah, I'll see if I can automate it. That's a good idea. I'm not sure if I can, but let me play around with that, Carolyn, and see
okay.
if I can.
The other thing I noticed that on the referral sheet, I don't know if it's fully updated, but the VI Spadat score is mandatory. It's one of those red starred items. Will that be changed and just removed, or how is that going to be? See,
That's right. So there are some items that will go away in the new system, and the main one is that current VI Spadat. So I still have it up there for now since we're in like a transition period. But on October 1, you will no longer need to report on a client's VI Spadat, nor will you actually be able to with the client's VI Spadat.
Okay.
Actually, I should say it might be an optional item because we still have one program that has VI Spadat in their eligibility criteria, and so we may actually we're still trying to figure out what to do about Fresh Start. Because you have to have a 10 or below. So I may leave it as an optional item, but it's not going to be required.
Gotcha.
I had another question too, Hanalea, because with the street outreach team, we use intake forms, and the VI for that is what's up there when we're asking those questions. So how would those intake forms change, like through the CoC, like through the NCCH intake forms that we were provided with for the HMIS system? How
Yeah.
would that work? Will there be new forms created to establish the vulnerability assessment?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I was asked by another provider to create paper versions of these, of like everything y'all need, and which is something I'm going to work on. But I hadn't thought about the fact that some of y'all already have packets provided by NCCH. Actually, could y'all send me the packet that y'all have now? Because I want to make sure I'm not creating something that is not going to work with what y'all have. So I can look
Yeah, I
at
can
that and
email
kind of
that to
see
you
how I
right
can
now.
merge them. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I'm about to email it to you.
Great. But just so everyone knows, all of these smart sheet forms do work on mobile phones. If you are like with the client and you have your mobile phone, you can use this to complete it with the provider. But I know some people need the paper forms. Any other questions for anything up to now?
I have a question, Hanalea, which is a little tangential and might actually be sort of for Lloyd, but this is also going to change some of the information that's in people's policies and procedures. And I'm aware that that is during the time where we are applying as part of the program competition. Has the city given thought to like when those changes need to be reflected?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm in conversations with Fresh Start because I knew theirs eligibility criteria specifically had VI Spadat in it, but I hadn't considered that was in others. Policies.
It's not so much the VI Spadat, it's that we, like in Dash, for example, we talk about the prioritization process that was, outlined the last time with policies and procedures, right? Mm-hmm. So we're willing to reflect the new criteria, but we do reference the order of priority and reference the VI Spadat as like a tool that we use. So I just want to make sure that
let me talk to Lloyd about that. That's a really good question and get back to you on that. Okay. Because I wasn't aware of that, but that's important. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Anything else, y'all? All right.
Also, Hanalea, not to like dig in on this, but just one thing about that is that many of us submitted our policies and procedures already in the pre-application stage. So if it's going to be, does it need to be reflected this time or the next time would be a question.
All right. So once I get the referral, I will be using HMIS to review and document the following information. Number of previous shelter entries, that's still something I'll be looking at, but then there are some new items as well. I'll also be looking at and documenting the number of times a client has previously been enrolled in rapid rehousing, the number of times the client has previously been enrolled in permanent supportive housing, and whether a client has had a housing choice voucher in the past 3 years that is no longer active. The reason for these last 3 items are these are items that are going to be considered in the permanent supportive housing needs assessment, which I'll get into a bit more later. So we're also creating a designation of a primary provider just to create a little bit more clarity. I've gotten some feedback from a number of providers that there's some confusion when you have multiple providers working with the client about who is, at the end of the day, like responsible for that client. So we're creating this designation of a primary provider just to help create clarity. The primary provider is responsible for conducting the comprehensive housing assessment. We're going to go into more about what that is in a minute. Making the housing referrals and keeping the client's data up to date on the by name list. So this is a chart that can help you determine who the primary provider is for any given client. So the first question you need to ask is, where is the client sleeping? If the client is an emergency shelter, no matter who else is the provider is working with that client, the emergency shelter provider is the primary provider. If the client is unsheltered, it's a little more complicated. So if the client is unsheltered and they're enrolled with Street Outreach is the primary provider. But if they're not enrolled with Street Outreach and they're working with Entry Point will be the primary provider. And if they're not working with either Entry Point or Street Outreach, the provider that referred to them to the by name list would be the primary provider. Any questions about this?
No.
Okay. All right, so the comprehensive housing assessment. So a comprehensive housing assessment needs to be conducted by the primary provider for all clients who are actively working on a viable diversion or rapid resolution plan within 14 days of program entry. So notice the word viable there. So basically what that means is that not only are you working with the client to be diverted or rapidly resolved, but you believe that this is something that is really viable, it can pan out, and it's going to happen pretty quickly. Otherwise, you need to do the comprehensive housing assessment with the client. Clients will only be considered for CoC permanent housing once the comprehensive housing assessment is completed. The comprehensive housing assessment will include, you need to determine an appropriate housing plan. So if you have a housing plan, when you refer the client to the by name list initially, please add that, but if not, that's okay. You have 2 weeks to really establish care with that client and figure out what an appropriate housing plan would look like, and then add that information on the by name list. You're going to conduct a housing barrier assessment. We'll go into what that looks like in a minute. You're going to assess and record the client's lifetime months homeless. So similarly, if you have this when the client enters, that's great, please add it. But if not, you need to get it within 2 weeks of the client's entry. Assess whether the client possesses required documents for housing referral, and create a plan to obtain any required documents not in the client's possession. So next, I want to go over the housing and barrier assessment with y'all.
Before you go on, may I ask a question, Hanalea? When you say street outreach, I know we always think about the street outreach team, but I wonder if we're included in that. If not, we're not included in any of those opportunities.
That's right, Carolyn, you're a street outreach project.
Thank you.
So for instance, if Open Table and Entry Point were working with a client who is unsheltered, Open Table would be the primary provider.
I just wanted a little clarity there, because we
Yeah,
always
absolutely,
think
absolutely.
of the street outreach team, and we're the little guys, but I just want to know where we fit. Thank you.
I'm glad you asked. Any other questions about that? Okay. So this is the housing barrier assessment. It's a Smartsheet form. There is a link to the form on the coordinated entry dashboard. All of y'all should have access to the coordinated entry dashboard, but if you don't, I'm happy to reshare it with you. I'll also send a follow-up email at the end of this meeting with a link to the dashboard. But so this is the assessment. So you'll put in the HMIS number of the head of household, any other adult HMIS numbers linked to the household, the name of the provider completing the assessment, and your organization. So the first section is justice involvement. So you'll be reporting on, has any adult in the household been convicted of any felonies? And so you're going to report on the most recent conviction. So if there was a conviction within the past few years, you click this. If there wasn't a conviction within the past 2 years, but there was one within the past 10 years, you click this. And if there were not any within the past 10 years, but there was one more than 10 years ago, you click this. And then if they have no felony convictions, there is always an item for client refused, doesn't know, or did not ask. Really, did not ask should not be something you're selecting, but it's there just because sometimes that does happen. But be aware, if the client refused or doesn't know, I'm going to show you how you can update this later if you get this information. So it's okay if initially a client's not sure about something and later on you're able to figure that out with the client and they'll get the points later, but I'll show you that in a minute. Has any adult in the household does any adult in the household have any pending felony charges currently? So these should be open charges that are pending and have not yet been decided. So yes or no. Has any adult in the household had any felony charges in the past 10 years that did not result in a conviction and are not currently pending? So these are charges that you have not already reported on above. You'd report on the most recent one. Does any adult in the household currently have pending misdemeanor charges? So again, these are open charges, not yet decided, yes or no. Has any adult in the household been convicted of a misdemeanor in the last 10 years? You're going to report on the most recent one. Has the client ever been convicted of manufacturing methamphetamine in public housing? So regardless of what you said above, this is just a separate question because of the specific challenges of around public housing and methamphetamine convictions, yes or no. And then is anyone in the household a registered sex offender? Yes or no. You'll notice there's no client doesn't know or client refused item because this is something that's publicly available information. So everyone should be able to answer this question. Housing and financial history is the next section. Household income. Client has income that can be documented. Client has income that cannot be documented. Client has no income. So income that cannot be documented and no income are scored the same way. Does any adult household member have a credit score below 550? Yes, no, it's okay. This is one of those items I anticipate in the beginning a lot of people won't know. It'd be great if you could pull the credit score for your client, but if that's going to take some time, you can put don't know and then go and fill it in later. Has any adult household member lost their housing in the last 10 years due to an eviction filing? So it's important to note here that they lost their housing due to a legal filing. This is not just, someone kicked you out. Yes, no, doesn't know. How much do adult household members currently owe a landlord? So $500 or more, between $1 and $499, nothing. I'd recommend if a client says, yes, I know I owe a landlord money, but I don't know how much, and you're working on finding out the information, put the low amount first, and then you can always up it, but at least client will get points for having known that they owe something. Then finally, housing needs. This section relates to, specific housing needs that can make it harder to find housing. Well, does the client need a disability accessible unit? Yes or no? Does anyone in the household have a pet, service animal, or emotional support animal? So yes, service animal for a qualifying disability that is trained to provide service tasks. Yes, a documented emotional support animal. Yes, pet or undocumented emotional support animal. Notice those are together because they create the same kind of barriers for the client. Even if the client says they're an emotional support animal, if they don't have documentation, it's going to look the same to a landlord or no. And then what is the fewest number of bedrooms that the household would accept for housing? Clients who need particularly large bedrooms present a particular challenge here. So it goes from 1 to 8. And then you'd submit. So let me show you where this information goes.
Hanalea, is this information due by October 1st as well?
For any client you've been working with for more than 2 weeks, yes.
Okay.
So this is the housing barrier assessment spreadsheet. It lives separately from the by name list. You will have access to this once you complete a housing barrier assessment. I will add you onto the sheet so that you can go in and actually see the information. And I'm going to show you how you can update it. But first I want to walk you through when you should update it. But before we do that, there's something really cool about the sheet, which is you don't actually have to manually import the result into your client's by name list referral. So So we notice here, we have a number of our clients who are in the training sheet. These are their HMIS numbers. So let's take, for example, client whose HMIS number is 1. So we can see here, this client's housing barrier score is about a 3.7. The reason it's kind of got decimal points is because I had to divide it to get it to equal the same amount as the vulnerability score. It's out of 24, but you really don't need to worry about that. So basically the client score is a 3.7. So then we actually go into the by name list. We find the client who's got a 1 HMIS ID, and we can see right here, the by name list already knows that their housing barrier score is a 3.7, which I think is pretty cool. So you don't have to do anything after you complete the assessment. It'll automatically be imported into the by name list as long as there's a match for an HMIS ID. The only time it has to be done manually is when you have additional adults in the household who need to have that housing barrier score attached. And that's something I can work with you on to do manually. But for the most part, this is not something that you have to worry about. So you'll notice some of these clients, it says no match on their prioritization score. And the reason for that is that the sheet cannot give the client a prioritization score until they have both a vulnerability score and a housing barrier score. So it's going to show no match for your client because you haven't done a housing barrier assessment for Christopher Clementine. So you know, okay, I need to go in and do a housing barrier assessment for Christopher Clementine so that then he gets a prioritization score. So give me a second. I'm going to switch over. All right, so this is a flow chart that I created to help you determine whether or not you need to do a new assessment and how to update the assessment if you have additional information. So let's say you have a client, you've been working for this client for 2 weeks and you need to figure out, do I need to do a housing barrier assessment with the client? So the first question you'd ask is a previous assessment conducted, yes or no? And I just showed you how to determine whether a previous assessment had been conducted. Look at that prioritization score. If it says no match, then you know no assessment was conducted. If there is a match, then you know, yes, the assessment was conducted. So the next thing you do, let's say the assessment was conducted, but it wasn't done by you, and you want to know, the next thing you want to know is how long ago was the assessment conducted? And I'm going to show you how to look at that. So if it was conducted 12 months or more, just conduct a new assessment. But if it was conducted within the past 12 months, it's a little more complicated. But let me show you how to see when the assessment was conducted. So if you actually go in here, let's say again, we're working with client number 1, and we want to see when the assessment was conducted. If we go here all the way to the end of the sheet, we can see the date that it was entered was like a week ago. Okay, so in this case, the assessment was done within the last week. We don't necessarily have to do a new assessment. So let's go back to our flow chart and see what we do next. So we're going to look at the assessment and see, does it appear accurate based on what I know about this client? So let's do that. Okay, so we're working with client number 1 here, and I can see what was filled out. So we can see he's saying no felony charges that did not result in convictions in the past 10 years. If you hover over it, you can see the full answer. He's got a felony conviction within the past 10 years. That's all right to me. No pending felony charges. He's not a sex offender. Oh, but look, it says no pending misdemeanors. And I know this client has a pending misdemeanor now. Okay, so let's go back to the flow chart and see what we do.
Analea?
Yeah.
I'm only seeing the flow chart. I'm not seeing the other things that you're.
Oh, okay. Thank you for letting me know that.
Yeah.
Let me reshare. I don't know why it won't let me flip back and forth. Okay, so let me show you that again. So you're actually going to go into the by name list. You're going to look, okay, we're working with client number 1. I found his assessment here. I see who completed it. Okay, Daryl completed this assessment. When did Daryl complete it? I'm at the very end here. I can see Daryl completed it a week ago, so I don't necessarily have to redo the assessment. The next thing I'm going to do is this assessment accurate based on what I know about the client? So again, if you hover over the response, it'll show you the full answer. So all of this looks right to me. Yes, yes, but then I see it says no pending misdemeanors, and I know that this client has a pending misdemeanor. Okay. So let's go back to our flow chart. Okay, so if the original assessment score appeared accurate, that's great. Nothing else needed to be done. But in this case, the assessment score did not appear accurate. And in fact, there's a missing item that would have made his score higher because he had a pending misdemeanor that it wasn't being accounted for in his barrier score. So I have some options. I can either conduct a new assessment, or I can contact the provider that completed the assessment to update his information. I would recommend, if the provider is still working with that client, to contact them. And if they're not, then conduct the new assessment. If you are going to conduct the new assessment, I would recommend look at the original assessment first, so you can use it to inform when you're talking with your client and you say, oh, I know, I see, for instance, I see that you're reporting no misdemeanors, but you told this other provider you did have some, and so that you can make sure your score is as accurate as possible. But let's say instead of missing an item, the score had something in it that was not correct and should have been lower. So let me show you what that would look like. So if we're back in client number 1, and we see that this client has a credit score below 550, but I know this client we've been working on his credit, and his credit is actually up above 550 now. And so he's getting points for something that is not actually accurate. So what do I do? So in that case, you need to contact the original provider that conducted the assessment and me to discuss. So basically, we don't want anyone lowering someone's score without having a conversation first. So that's why we're saying, don't just go ahead and conduct a new assessment. First, let's have a conversation about the fact that you believe it should be lower. So one final thing I'll add to all of this is, if the assessment was conducted by you or by a provider at your agency, you can just go in and update it without redoing the assessment. So let me show you how that looks. So we only want you editing the spreadsheet assessments if the assessment was done by you or someone at your organization. So let's say I'm Sarah Smith. I did this assessment for client number 2. And now I've just learned that this client now actually, let's say, originally she told us she had low credit, but now I've learned that, her credit has been moved up. So I can actually just go in for this client and update that. I don't have to redo the assessment, or someone else at my organization could do that. But we don't want you, let's say you're Daryl at another organization. We don't want Daryl going in and editing entry points assessments, because we don't want people editing, each other. So always check before you edit anything. Always check, okay, yes, this is the assessment I did. This is at my organization. I can go ahead and edit this. So give me a second. So the bottom line here is, this is intended as a progressive measure of a client's barriers to obtaining housing. So this isn't something where we expect that you're going to do the assessment one time, it's going to be perfect, and you're going to move on. Because we recognize that we learn things about clients' housing barriers as we work with them. So let's say you've got a client initially, they're saying, no, I've never had an eviction, I don't owe a landlord any money. But then you start actually applying for housing with them, and they're getting denied because they owe a landlord money. You learned that they have a barrier that they weren't aware of or they didn't report to you. That's actually a positive thing. That's the way the system is built. So as you work with a client, their housing barriers may increase because you're learning more about what actually they're dealing with. And they may actually move up the prioritization accordingly. And that's actually intended. This is the way this is intended, that the client may look low priority initially, but as you work with them, they may actually show to be higher priority. And that's a good thing, because as we learn more about our clients, we're going to be reporting on them and saying, hey, I thought this client could self-resolve. That's really not going to happen here. Look at all the barriers they're experiencing. So as you go, you're going to be updating the barriers assessment. You're going to be updating new disabilities that you learned about. You're going to be updating that information. Maybe the client went to the hospital, and their priority may move up. And that's a good thing, because we're working with the client and we're really learning the comprehensive view of that client. And we don't expect you to have everything in those first 2 weeks. So really think of that first assessment as a starting point. And it's really important that you stay on top of updating information, both in the by name list and in the housing barrier assessment as you get it, because that's the only way for your client to get access to their correct prioritization. Any questions about the housing barrier assessment?
I had a quick question, Hanalea.
Mhm.
So for the housing barrier assessment, so it's not like the VIAS for that. So will we need a paper version for that as well? Or this is something that you want us to just get the information over time?
Yeah, so I was asked to do a paper version just because some providers work with paper. So I am going to be working on that. You don't obviously you don't have to use a paper version, but I know some people prefer paper. So so that is something. Yeah. So we are, you know, I think we are expecting that you're going to sit down and do the assessment with the client at some point. But then if more information comes out after that point, then you just add it in the sheet.
Okay, and one more thing. Can you go back to where it's located again?
You're thinking of the spreadsheet or the form itself?
So the spreadsheet.
Mhm.
Where is the spreadsheet located again?
Yeah, so the spreadsheet is not yet in the dashboard because at the moment I don't want people going into it until people are starting to complete housing barrier assessments. So what's going to happen at first is once I see you've completed an assessment, you'll receive a link to me in your email that shares it, but it is going to end up on the dashboard. I just haven't put it there yet.
Okay, so once we go in, say we start going in and replacing all the information on
Mhm.
for like replacing the VIAS for that situation, all of that stuff. Once we go in and start completing that stuff, you'll send us something in the email with that link, the housing barrier assessment link.
That's right. And that's just for the internal. So let me show you where the external link is. So let's pull up the dashboard. So this is the coordinated entry dashboard, and you can see right here there's this link to the housing barrier assessment. This will take you to the assessment itself, and this is what you should be completing with your client. Once I see you've actually completed one of these, then I'm going to give you access to the internal spreadsheet. But I just want people to fill out start just filling out the external assessment before you start fiddling with stuff in the internal spreadsheet. But you will be able to get a link from the dashboard. Again, if you don't have current access to the dashboard, I'm going to send a link as a follow-up. I highly recommend bookmarking the dashboard because it's got a lot of useful links on it. It also has, always a link to the by name list, a link to the referral form. This VI SPDAT exception form is going to go away once we make the switch. The rapid rehousing application, the PSH application, kind of everything you need is here. So I strongly recommend bookmarking this dashboard.
Did you say you were going to send that out? I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm going to send a follow-up email with a link to the dashboard after this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Elaine, when would this recording be available?
When I send the email, I will send a link to this recording. It'll be sometime today.
Hanalei, I had one more quick question.
Absolutely.
So you said go to the dashboard first to do the external way, like clicking on the housing, right, clicking on that. And then you'd rather us do it that way. But if we put in someone new, say we put in a new client, their client's not on the by name list yet, or they're not on the by name list yet, we put in a new client, we'll get a link to our email with that to do that assessment, correct?
Yeah, so let's walk through, if you have a new client, what that would look like. So I've got a new client. I'm going to go to the dashboard. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the by name list client referral form. I'm going to go in, I'm going to do this. I'm going to fill everything out for my client. And then, this is hard because I was already saying me. Okay, let's say instead Shaniqua. Shaniqua goes in, she fills out the referral form. It goes into the by name list. I will look at it. I will fill in all the additional information that's needed, and then I will open your client on the by name list referral or on the by name list. Then you're going to go in, Shaniqua, and let's say you just referred Harry Honeydew on, and you're going to go in and make sure that all the information is in there for the client. So let's say Harry Honeydew, his wife is pregnant, and that wasn't something you knew at first or something, you're going to go in, or let's say he had a hospital stay, you're going to update that. And then within 2 weeks of working with Harry Honeydew, Shaniqua is going to go back to the dashboard. Oh, wrong thing. And then Shaniqua was going to click on this housing barrier assessment. And she's going to conduct this assessment with her client, which will add it to the housing barrier assessment spreadsheet. Now, Shaniqua doesn't need to do anything else from there. It'll be automatically pulled into the by name list. But Shaniqua will also receive a link from me to this internal spreadsheet where if she needs to go in and update information for her client after the fact, she can. So after she conducts that initial assessment, she gets more information. She'll receive a link for me to be able to go in and update this information. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Great. Any other questions? All right.
So none of this goes into the client point part. It's all by name list stuff. So we have 2 entries that we need to make initially.
Everything lives outside of HMIS right now. Eventually, hopefully this assessment will go into HMIS, but that's a much longer process.
Okay. But HMIS is still required first. And then the referral to the by name list comes out of that. Is that right?
All right. So we've conducted the housing barrier assessment. We've updated it as need be. So how do these scores get combined to create a client's housing priority score? So the scores are going to be weighted and automatically combined to create that final housing priority score. So the vulnerability score receives a 0.75 weight and the housing barrier score receive a 0.25 weight. Basically what this means is that the vulnerability score gets weighted more than the housing barrier score. So when you look at your client's vulnerability score, the vulnerability score accounts more for their vulnerability than their housing barrier score. So let me show you how that looks. And it's all automated, so it's all built in the sheet. So here's the client's housing barrier score, and here's the client's vulnerability score, and then they get combined into this prioritization score. This prioritization score is what we're going to use in replacement for the VSBDAT when we sort the sheet. And there's an automatic formula in here that combines them. You can see it here. But basically that's what you need to worry about, is that this prioritization score at the end of the day is what your client needs to be prioritized. All right. The next thing on the next slides go into some changes to the referral process. So before I move on, any other questions about assessments, filling out information on the by name list, forms, any other questions that we missed?
Well, I did want to hear a response to kind of what Carolyn said about the HMIS. So does everything go into HMIS first still, and then we'll do the by name list next, correct?
That's right. So not all of this information is going to be in HMIS, but your HMIS entries haven't changed. They'll still look the way they have.
Okay, and when it comes to the VSBDAT in HMIS, are we not required to do that now?
That's correct. You're no longer required to do
Okay.
that is one change that is changing in HMIS. You no longer have to do a VSBDAT.
You're breaking up. I didn't hear that, the response. No, we're not doing the HMIS and, I'm sorry, the VSBDAT in HMIS?
That's correct. You're no longer required to do a VSBDAT in HMIS.
Gotcha.
But what about, like you said, for Fresh Start? You said for
yeah,
like
I still have to figure out what to do about Fresh Start. So to be determined. I think it might be for a while that, like, once we start talking about your client for Fresh Start, I may ask you to just get a score. If there's an old score, we'll just use that. But if there's like literally no score on the client, we just have to show those clients under a 10. But I'm working with them on it. So there will be an answer before we make the switch. But I'm not quite sure what we're going to do for Fresh Start yet.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so we're making some changes to the referral process. So the big change with rapid rehousing referrals is that you must submit a completed referral with all your required documentation via the central referral form before your client will be considered for prioritization. So the way it used to work is I said, okay, your client's being prioritized. Now you need to go in and submit the referrals. That is no longer the way this is going to work. You need to submit a referral to me in order for your client to be considered. So, you know, it's the opposite now, where before you might have submitted the referral and I sent you an email saying, hey, this client hasn't been prioritized yet. Now I'm expecting to get a referral in when you have all your documents, and then we'll go ahead and we'll look at them for prioritization. My recommendation for clients that are looking at rapid rehousing is, let's say you have all the documents for a regular rapid rehousing referral, but you don't yet have the chronicity documentation for Fresh Start. My recommendation is go ahead and put the initial referral in with the basic documentation and then resubmit once you have the Fresh Start information. Once we prioritize that client and I send that referral on to the provider needs to review the referral within 7 days of receiving it and notify the referring provider of any missing documents. The referring provider will then have until the next by name list meeting to address the issues. If they're not addressed by the next by name list meeting, we will move on them prioritization. And then the provider needs to schedule the intake within 14 days of receiving a completed referral. That doesn't mean the intake needs to happen. It just needs to be scheduled within 14 days. Oh, the next thing is permanent supportive housing. So before we move on, are there any questions about the way that the rapid rehousing referrals are going to work now? Okay, and just a reminder that the rapid rehousing referral form is on that same dashboard. So that's something you want to be working on is if you have clients who are document ready, getting their referrals in. Okay, so the next part is permanent supportive housing referrals. So in order to consider who needs permanent supportive housing, we looked at data about who was most likely to return to homelessness after being rapidly rehoused among chronically homeless clients. So these are the three variables that we found were significant. So head of household that was age 18 to 35 was 3 times more likely to return to homelessness from rapid rehousing. Clients with a mental health disability, that should not say mental health problem, but mental health disability, were 4.5 times more likely to return to homelessness after being in rapid rehousing. And those with a chronic health condition disability were 2.6 times more likely to return to homelessness after being in rapid rehousing. We combined this information with an evaluation that had been done a couple of years ago that found that clients were more likely to return to homelessness after being in permanent supportive housing if they had a substance abuse disability or were justice involved. And we created this permanent supportive housing needs assessment out of it. So mental health disability gets 2 points because it was the strongest predictor, but everything else will receive 1 point. And you can see on here why I'm also going to be adding to the by name list the client's housing history around previous housing attempts by the client, because they will receive a point for each time they were previously housed by the CoC. And so what this will create is a needs assessment score. Let me show you all how this looks. And again, this is all automated in the sheet. You don't have to worry about doing this manually. So you'll see, in addition to your client's vulnerability score, they're also going to have a PSH needs assessment score. It's automatically calculated based on the information in the sheet. And so this is going to be used qualitatively by this group, and we'll be looking at it to see who needs to be bumped up. So we might say, okay, let's look at anyone who's got a 4 or above. Let's look at anyone who's got a 3 and above. This is something the group's going to use as a tool to help us figure out who to consider. And then from there, we'll still use the prioritization score to rank clients, but it's just going to help us create a pool of clients who need permanent supportive housing. Any questions about this? Okay. All right, so the PSH referral process hasn't changed significantly. It's still going to be prioritized first, then refer. But we're just going to put some more parameters on how long this process should go, just to reduce the amount of discretion and reduce the back and forth between me and y'all around like how long you have to submit and things. So the expectation is now that once your client is prioritized, providers have 14 days to submit the completed referral via the central referral form. Again, that central referral form can be found on the dashboard. Within 7 days of receiving the referral, the provider needs to review it and notify the referring provider of any missing documents. The referring provider then has another week to correct anything missing. Otherwise, the slot will be released. And then the provider needs to schedule the intake within 14 days of receiving the completed referral. Again, the intake does not need to occur within 14 days, just needs to be scheduled within 14 days. Any questions about this timeline? All right. Finally, I'm also making some changes to the housing choice referral process. It's going to look a lot more like the new rapid rehousing referral process. So starting next month, referrals will be submitted on the front end and prioritization will happen on the back end. So there'll be no more first week of the month, I send out an email with a Google form and you have to submit, then we prioritize, then you have until the end of the month to submit. Now what's going to happen is it's just going to be via that application form that you use once your client was prioritized. You're going to submit your client once they've got all their documents together for the application, and we'll do prioritization for all submitted applications the last week of each month for any available slots. So it's going to reduce the steps and reduce the issue of like holding slots while a client's not able to get documents. So it's just going to be once you get the documents in, you put in your client, and then we'll prioritize for everything we have available at the end of the month. So more information on this to come. I'll probably be doing a follow-up on this. We're going to need to add some new information to the form and things. So keep an eye out. This month it's going to look the same. It'll start next month, but just a heads up that this process is also going to be changing. Any questions about this? All right. That is it for the training. Next, we have the timeline. So as we've discussed, the change will take effect on October 1. And so here's your to-do list before October 1. Conduct a housing barrier assessment for all of your clients. Check and update the following information on the by name list for all of your existing clients. Report on whether or not they're pregnant, and if they are pregnant, provide a due date. Report on their disability types. I've filled them in for some clients. Go in and check them, make sure they look right. Note that disability is based on disability that's been reported in the past 3 years. So I may see a disability in HMIS that you don't see. So if there's an HMIS, there's a disability in there that the client hasn't reported to you on, make a note of it, don't remove it, but work on adding disabilities that we missed. The number of months that the client has been unsheltered in the past 3 years, and the number of hospitalizations the client has had while receiving services. So again, this is not nights hospitalized, but a separate hospitalization with a discharge, and that includes detox and psychiatric hospitalizations, and it's while working with you. And then submit a rapid rehousing referral for all document-ready clients whose housing plan includes rapid rehousing. Any questions about the to-do list? All right. So that is the end of the training. I am going to be sending a follow-up email with y'all. It will have the actual written policies and procedures that this training was based on. It will have a link to this PowerPoint as well as the recording of the training and a link to the dashboard.